The mistress believed she owned everything, until I exposed the real will in the court. The first thing I noticed at my husband's funeral was how quiet my name felt. Not unspoken, not forbidden, just unnecessary. It drifted somewhere behind the polite murmurs and the shuffling of coats, behind the scent of lilies and damp wool. People nodded at me with practiced sympathy, but their attention kept sliding forward, toward the front row, where a woman sat as if she belonged there by design. She wore a fitted dress in a shade that flattered grief without surrendering to it, her makeup flawless, her expression delicately wounded. When my son Daniel rose to speak, every movement in the room seemed to adjust itself around her presence. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Robert had been dead for 4 days. A sudden accident, they said. Rain, faulty brakes, a sharp curve that had no mercy. The doctor assured me he hadn't suffered. I nodded when told, because nodding was easier than asking whether he had earned peace. 40 years of marriage had taught me how to nod at the right moments. I wore his favorite charcoal coat to the service, the one he liked because it made us look respectable together. The wind cut through the cemetery, numbing my fingers as I stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a smile that felt borrowed. Robert had always cared about appearances. Even now, I found myself maintaining them for him. Daniel stood at the podium with his shoulders straight and his voice steady. He was 33, successful, composed in a way that reminded me painfully of his father. He read a tribute filled with carefully chosen words about integrity, dedication, and legacy. I listened closely, waiting for the space where I thought I would finally fit. When he paused, the silence felt heavy, expectant. I gripped my handbag, my knuckles whitening. I was certain I knew what he would say. After all these years, after all the quiet sacrifices, surely he would see me. Instead, he thanked another woman. He spoke her name with reverence, as if it carried warmth, as if it belonged to the story of his life more naturally than mine. He said she had supported his father through the hardest years, that she had been a true family in ways words could not fully capture. The room shifted, heads turning, curiosity blooming like an uninvited flower. The woman in the front row stood briefly, dabbing her eyes, accepting the attention with graceful humility. Her emerald coat caught the light. She nodded as though she had rehearsed this moment privately, long before Robert died. I felt something inside me loosen, not shatter, just detach. The sound in my ears grew distant, as if the room had slipped underwater. People whispered. Someone behind me murmured that she was sitting so close, like family. I barely registered the condolences offered to me afterward. My responses came automatically, polite and empty. When I heard Daniel lean toward her and whisper that she was truly family, the words landed with a finality that left me hollow. That night, the house felt larger than it ever had. I removed my coat and noticed the ribbon inside was creased, the fabric no longer obedient. It seemed symbolic, though I didn't linger on the thought. I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chairs. Robert's seat remained untouched. For decades, he had sat there waiting for me to bring his soup, his paper, his quiet comforts. Now the armrest was cold. His beer still waited in the refrigerator. Habit, I realized, was crueler than grief. Sleep refused me. I opened old photo albums, flipping through images of a younger version of us. There had been light once, or at least the illusion of it. I found my old employee identification card from the firm where we had both worked. I had been confident then, professionally sharp, seated at board meetings instead of dinner tables. He had told me I didn't need that life anymore, that he would take care of everything. I believed him. I closed the album gently, as if it might bruise. The next morning, the lawyer's office smelled of paper and old furniture. Sunlight filtered through blinds, dividing the floor into narrow stripes. The lawyer spoke slowly, formally, reading from a will signed 3 years earlier. Robert's assets, properties, accounts, all designated to the same woman Daniel had honored the day before. I waited for my name to appear, even as dread pressed against my ribs. It never did. I looked at my son. He did not look back. His hands were folded neatly, his expression neutral. When the reading ended, I stood and asked him quietly if he had known. He said his father had his reasons. He said the woman understood him. He said I did not. In that moment, I understood something colder than betrayal. I was being rewritten out of my own life. At home, I opened Robert's closet. His shirts hung in perfect order, ties aligned with meticulous care. The scent of him lingered, refined and faintly dishonest. I began searching drawers, not for confrontation, but for confirmation that I hadn't imagined my own displacement. I found letters addressed to her, documents I had never seen. One envelope referenced a coastal property I had visited for years, never knowing I was only a guest. I crossed the street to speak with our neighbor, a woman with a memory sharp enough to wound. When I mentioned the other woman's name, her expression tightened. She spoke of symphonies, of holiday lights, of moments I had been excluded from without ever being informed. She said she had always assumed the woman was family. 15 years, perhaps longer. I listened, my body still, my mind reeling. In the basement, I discovered an old box of photographs. There was Robert beside her, relaxed, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. There was Daniel too, younger, standing close. On the back of one photograph, faint writing revealed a promise of a future I had never been invited to share. Something broke inside me then, something essential and final. That evening, I lit a candle and played music, slow and deliberate. For the first time, I listened without adjusting myself to someone else's rhythm. I wondered who I might have been if I had chosen differently, if I had insisted on visibility instead of endurance. The thought was unsettling, but also quietly thrilling. I believed the worst was behind me. I was wrong. When Daniel agreed to meet me at the cafe from his childhood, I arrived early. He sat across from me like a stranger, his phone placed face down, his posture guarded. He asked why I had sent a legal notice. He said it made people uncomfortable. I reminded him of what I had given up, of the ring I sold to fund his education. He reacted with irritation, not recognition. He told me his father had been happiest with her, that she respected him, that I was too strong. The phrase echoed unpleasantly. Strength, I realized, had become my offense. I stood calmly and told him I would reserve that strength for myself. When I left, the rain had begun, steady and unrelenting. Sitting in my car, I did not cry. I felt something steadier than grief take root. Loss had stripped me of illusions, but it had also freed me from waiting. That was when I understood that my life had not ended at a funeral. It had been quietly waiting for me to reclaim it. That realization did not soften the past, but it sharpened the future. I no longer needed permission to exist fully. The silence that had once erased me now felt like space, open and waiting to be filled. And for the first time in decades, I intended to fill it on my own terms. I understood then that silence had been my longest habit, and breaking it felt like learning a new language. The days after the cafe meeting blurred together, marked only by small rituals I performed without thinking. I watered the plants at the same hour, wiped counters that were already clean, folded laundry that no longer belonged to anyone but me. Each action felt like an echo of a life that had once revolved around Robert's needs. Yet beneath the routine, something restless stirred, a pressure that demanded movement instead of endurance. On a gray afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The house was quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums faintly with unresolved tension. I opened my laptop and searched for Linda's name. Her public profile appeared immediately, polished and composed. She smiled in every photograph, always positioned in flattering light, always framed by tasteful scenery. Her biography spoke of gratitude, culture, and community, words that suggested depth without ever revealing substance. I scrolled slowly, my fingers steady despite the tightness in my chest. There was Robert, seated in a wicker chair, laughing over a slice of pie she had made. The date stamp placed the image firmly in a year when I had been confined to bed, my joints swollen and aching, My world reduced to pain management and quiet patience. He had told me work was overwhelming then, that travel was unavoidable. I had believed him, mistaking avoidance for exhaustion. There were more images, moments stitched together into a life I had never seen. Robert helping her plant flowers, wearing the jacket I had given him. Robert toasting her during a holiday gathering, his expression soft and unguarded. And then I saw Daniel. Younger, unsure, but present. Linda's arm rested casually around his shoulders as she praised him, as if she had earned the right. My breath caught. This was not a coincidence. It was choreography. I closed the laptop slowly. The truth settled with a dull weight, not explosive but undeniable. Linda had not stumbled into Robert's life at the end. She had woven herself into it deliberately, patiently, over years. And Daniel had not been an accidental witness. He had been part of the picture long before I understood there was a second frame. That evening, I called Ruth. Her voice carried the same brisk warmth I remembered from our working years. She offered condolences, but I interrupted gently, telling her I needed help. Not emotional, not symbolic, but practical. I told her what I suspected, what the patterns suggested. There was a pause, longer than politeness allowed. Then she asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted the truth. We agreed to meet. In the meantime, I returned to places I had once navigated confidently. The local library, with its quiet rows and faint smell of dust, became a refuge. I requested property records, scanning dates and signatures. Linda's name appeared where it shouldn't have, attached to purchases timed too neatly with Robert's professional authority. Each discovery tightened the narrative, transforming suspicion into structure. When I visited Ruth's house, she greeted me with lemon tea and a look that blended concern with respect. She had already begun pulling records, tracing payments that flowed through shell entities, sums that evaded scrutiny by falling just outside audit windows. She spoke carefully, explaining what could be proven and what would require patience. I listened without interruption. This was a language I understood. Driving home afterward, the sky brightened briefly, sunlight cutting through the clouds. I felt oddly calm. The path ahead was clear, even if it promised discomfort. I organized documents at my desk that night, labeling folders, arranging evidence. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt purposeful. When I contacted a lawyer, her voice was firm and measured. She asked questions that assumed competence rather than fragility. I sent her everything. The days that followed filled with correspondence, meetings, and the slow unfolding of legal machinery. Linda responded with indignation, Daniel with anger. He accused me of destroying his father's memory. I told him memory built on lies was not worth preserving. The case moved forward. Depositions were taken. Invoices were examined and dismantled. Linda's carefully curated image began to fracture under scrutiny. I watched from a distance, my involvement precise and contained. I did not seek revenge. I sought restoration, not of what was lost, but of what had been taken without consent. Testifying was harder than I expected. I spoke of years spent supporting a life that had quietly excluded me. I spoke of finances managed, careers surrendered, choices deferred. The judge listened attentively, her gaze steady. When the ruling came, it was decisive. Funds were to be returned. Properties liquidated. Linda's silence afterward was complete. The victory did not feel triumphant. It felt final. Linda disappeared from my life as abruptly as she had emerged into it. The house grew quieter still, but the silence had changed. It no longer pressed against me. It waited. Daniel did not call for a long time. I missed him with a dull ache, tempered by understanding. Grief distorts loyalty. Illusions defend themselves fiercely. I let him go, trusting time to do what arguments could not. I returned to small pleasures. Music in the evenings. Long walks without destination. I planted new flowers in the garden, choosing colors Robert would have dismissed. When they bloomed, earlier than expected, I laughed aloud, startled by the sound of my own joy. Years later, Daniel called. His voice was tentative, older. We met at a family gathering marked by another loss. We spoke carefully at first, then more freely. He listened as I told the full story, details he had never allowed himself to hear. He apologized without excuses. I forgave him without conditions. That night, after everyone had gone, I stood beneath the tree I had planted decades earlier. It had nearly died once, starved of attention, dismissed as inconvenient. Yet it bloomed again, stubborn and bright. I touched its bark gently, feeling the steady pulse of something that refused erasure. Inside, I removed my shoes and walked barefoot across the floor. The house no longer felt like a monument to endurance. It felt like shelter. I knew who I was then, not because someone had finally acknowledged me, but because I had claimed myself. The truth had not restored what I lost, but it had freed what remained. And that, I realized, was enough. The morning after the ruling, I woke before sunrise, not because of anxiety or habit, but because my body seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted. The house was still, wrapped in a thin blue light that made every surface appear softer, less demanding. I lay in bed for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, surprised by how steady it sounded. 4 years, waking had meant immediately accounting for someone else's needs, anticipating moods, schedules, expectations. Now there was only the quiet question of what I wanted to do next. I rose slowly and walked into the kitchen, barefoot against the cool floor. I made tea instead of coffee, savoring the deliberate pace of the ritual. Steam curled upward as I poured the water, and I watched it dissipate, thinking how often I had rushed through moments like this without noticing them. I carried the mug to the window and looked out at the garden. The early light caught the leaves, outlining them in gold. It struck me that the world had not paused for my grief or my reckoning. It had simply continued, waiting for me to rejoin it. The legal battle had concluded, but its echo lingered. Friends who had drifted away during my marriage began reaching out again, cautiously at first, as if unsure whether I still recognized myself. Some apologized for their absence, others for not asking harder questions years ago. I accepted their words without bitterness. Distance, I had learned, was not always cruelty. Sometimes it was confusion, sometimes fear. Rebuilding connections felt like reopening rooms I had sealed shut long ago, dust motes swirling as light returned. I also revisited parts of myself I had abandoned. I enrolled in a continuing education course on financial ethics, not because I needed the credential, but because it reminded me of who I had once been. Sitting in a classroom again, surrounded by people of varying ages and stories, I felt a quiet thrill. My questions were sharp, my insights welcomed. No one asked whose wife I was or how long I planned to stay. I was simply there, fully. Daniel remained distant, though not hostile. Occasionally he sent brief messages, updates about work, neutral observations about the weather or shared acquaintances. I replied in kind, careful not to push. Healing, I understood now, was not a demand but an invitation. I trusted that if he was ready, he would step through the open door. There were nights when memories returned uninvited. I would be folding laundry or washing dishes when a particular inflection of Robert's voice would surface, or the memory of a silence that had once felt heavier than words. Instead of pushing these moments away, I allowed them space. Grief, when acknowledged, softened its grip. I no longer needed to prove my endurance by swallowing pain whole. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I came across correspondence from my parents. Letters written in careful script, full of encouragement I had once dismissed as sentimental. They had worried about me, about how completely I had disappeared into my marriage. Reading their words now, I felt both sorrow and gratitude. They had seen what I could not. I whispered an apology into the empty room, unsure who it was meant for, but relieved to release it. The house itself began to change. I donated Robert's clothing, keeping only a few items that felt neutral, unburdened by deception. I rearranged furniture, moving the dining table closer to the window, replacing heavy curtains with lighter ones. Each change felt symbolic, though I resisted overanalyzing it. Sometimes transformation was simply practical. I started volunteering at a local legal aid clinic, offering financial literacy workshops for women navigating separation or widowhood. Sitting across from them, listening to stories that echoed pieces of my own, I felt a sense of purpose deepen. I did not offer platitudes. I offered clarity, tools, and reassurance that survival did not require erasure. Watching their shoulders relax as understanding dawned was more rewarding than any victory I had won in court. One evening, as autumn settled in, I hosted a small dinner. It was the first time I had invited people over without calculating Robert's preferences or tolerances. The conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating the clink of glasses. At one point, someone asked how I had found the courage to rebuild so completely. I considered the question carefully before answering. Courage, I realized, was not something I had found. It was something that had surfaced when there was nothing left to lose. As the guests departed, I stood alone in the kitchen, surveying the remnants of warmth they had left behind. The silence that followed was gentle, companionable. I cleaned slowly, humming to myself, aware of a contentment that felt earned rather than borrowed. Months passed. Seasons turned. The tree in the yard shed its leaves and then, astonishingly, budded again. I watched this cycle with a growing sense of kinship. Life did not ask permission to begin anew. It simply did. Daniel's call came on a quiet afternoon. His voice was hesitant, layered with emotions he had not yet named. He asked if we could meet, not at a cafe or a formal setting, but at my house. I agreed, my heart steady. When he arrived, he stood awkwardly in the doorway, older than I remembered, lines of experience etched into his face. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I had once stared into cold coffee and unresolved truth. This time, the air between us felt open. He spoke slowly, recounting his confusion, his loyalty to a version of his father that had shielded him from discomfort. He admitted his fear of confronting complexity, of admitting that love could coexist with betrayal. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him what I had learned about strength, about how it had been mistaken for rigidity, for lack of need. I told him that being strong had never meant being invulnerable. It had meant continuing to care, even when unseen. He nodded, tears finally breaking through. We did not resolve everything that day. We did not need to. Understanding had begun, and that was enough. After he left, I walked through the house, touching familiar surfaces with renewed appreciation. Each room held memories, but they no longer defined me. They were chapters, not conclusions. I went to bed that night with the windows open, letting the cool air carry in the scent of possibility. In the quiet before sleep, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. Betrayal had stripped away illusions, but it had also revealed resilience I had long underestimated. I was no longer invisible, not because others finally saw me, but because I refused to disappear. My life, once shaped by endurance alone, had expanded into something richer, more deliberate. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer frightened me. I had faced erasure and reclaimed myself. Whatever came next would meet a woman who understood her worth, not as an abstract principle, but as a lived truth. And that knowledge, hard-won and deeply rooted, would guide me forward, one chosen step at a time. The following months unfolded with a quiet steadiness that still surprised me. I had expected turbulence, emotional aftershocks that would knock me off balance just when I believed myself healed. Instead, life seemed to stretch out patiently, inviting me to inhabit it at my own pace. I learned that recovery did not always announce itself with dramatic milestones. Sometimes it arrived disguised as ordinary mornings, unremarkable afternoons, and evenings that ended without regret. I began keeping my calendar deliberately sparse. Where it once overflowed with reminders of obligations and social appearances chosen to reflect well on Robert, it now held only what I genuinely wanted. A walk by the river. A lecture at the university. Lunch with Ruth, who had become both ally and friend in a way that felt earned rather than circumstantial. With every decision, small or large, I felt myself reasserting authorship over my own days. Ruth and I met often, usually at a cafe halfway between our homes. We talked less about the case now and more about everything else. She told me about her daughter's struggles, about her own quiet regrets, about the strange freedom that came with later life when expectation loosened its grip. In turn, I spoke of my rediscovered interests, of the classes I was taking, of the women I met through the legal aid clinic. We laughed more than I would have thought possible a year earlier. Laughter, I realized, was not betrayal of grief. It was proof of survival. At the clinic, I saw reflections of myself everywhere. Women who had spent decades believing that loyalty required silence. Women who feared starting over more than they feared disappearing entirely. I shared my story selectively, never centering myself, but allowing pieces of truth to surface when they might help. I watched as their posture shifted, as comprehension softened their self-blame. In those moments, I felt the full weight of what I had endured transform into something purposeful. Daniel visited more frequently. Our conversations remained cautious, but the distance between us gradually shortened. He asked questions now, real ones, not defensive challenges. He wanted to know what I had felt, not just what had happened. I answered honestly, without embellishment or restraint. Sometimes he flinched, sometimes he nodded slowly, absorbing what he had once resisted. Trust, I learned, was rebuilt not through forgiveness alone, but through sustained truth. One evening, he stayed for dinner. We cooked together, awkward at first, then more naturally. He chopped vegetables the way he always had, too large, too uneven. I teased him gently, and he smiled, the boyishness I remembered flickering through. When we sat down to eat, there was no empty chair looming between us, no ghostly expectation of Robert's presence. There was just food, conversation, and the fragile comfort of shared effort. After Daniel left, I washed the dishes and stood for a long time at the sink, hands submerged in warm water. I thought about how many years I had spent here, performing this task with resignation rather than intention. Now even this felt different. Nothing about the sink had changed, but I had. The shift was subtle, but it was everywhere. Winter came gently that year. Snow fell in light, persistent layers, muffling the world. I spent more time indoors, reading, writing, reflecting. I began journaling, not to document pain, but to trace growth. The entries surprised me. They were not consumed by anger or loss, but by curiosity. Who might I become next? What had I not yet tried? The questions felt expansive rather than burdensome. I also traveled alone for the first time. A short trip, nothing extravagant, but meaningful nonetheless. I chose the destination without consulting anyone, booked a small hotel, and spent days wandering museums and streets at my own rhythm. There was a moment, standing before a painting I had admired decades earlier, when I felt an overwhelming sense of presence. I was there, fully, unaccompanied and unafraid. The realization settled deep in my chest, warm and affirming. When spring returned, it brought with it a sense of renewal that felt almost conspiratorial. The garden bloomed again, more vibrant than I remembered. I spent hours outside, hands in the soil, grounding myself in something tangible. Neighbors stopped to chat, some cautiously, others openly. They remarked on how well I seemed, how different the house felt. I thanked them, though I knew the difference was not in the paint or the flowers. It was in the air I carried with me. The anniversary of Robert's death passed quietly. I had anticipated an emotional storm, but instead I felt reflective, solemn, and oddly peaceful. I lit a candle that evening, not out of obligation, but acknowledgement. He had been a significant part of my life, even if that life had not been what I believed. Honoring the truth of that complexity felt more honest than clinging to idealized memories. Later that night, I received a message from Daniel. He said he had been thinking about his father differently, seeing contradictions he had once ignored. He thanked me for not abandoning him, even when he had turned away. I replied simply, telling him that love was not conditional on agreement. It was sustained by presence. He responded with a heart emoji, something small but telling. As the months continued, I noticed how often people asked me for advice. Not just about finances or legal matters, but about life decisions, boundaries, reinvention. I answered carefully, aware of the responsibility implicit in being seen as someone who had survived and thrived. I never framed my story as exceptional. I emphasized patience, honesty, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork, I came across my marriage certificate. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly faded. I held it for a long moment, feeling neither nostalgia nor resentment. It represented a chapter that had shaped me profoundly, even as it constrained me. I placed it back in the folder, not as a relic, but as a record. It belonged to my history, not my identity. I realized then that freedom was not the absence of attachment, but the presence of choice. I had not lost everything at that funeral. I had lost an illusion, and in doing so, gained clarity. The clarity was not always comfortable, but it was empowering. It allowed me to see myself not as a supporting character in someone else's narrative, but as the author of my own. On a warm evening toward the end of summer, I hosted another gathering, larger this time. Friends old and new filled the house, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of shared experience. Daniel arrived with a quiet confidence, greeting people easily, standing beside me without hesitation. When someone raised a glass and asked me to say a few words, I felt no fear, only gratitude. I spoke briefly, thanking them for their presence, for their patience, for the reminder that life continued to offer connection even after profound loss. I did not mention betrayal or lawsuits or pain. I spoke of resilience, of choosing oneself without bitterness, of allowing truth to clear space for joy. The applause that followed was gentle, sincere. After everyone had gone, I walked alone into the garden. The night air was soft, carrying the scent of flowers and distant rain. I stood beneath the tree that had nearly been cut down years earlier, its branches full and strong. I rested my hand against its trunk and smiled. I knew then, with a certainty that needed no witness, that I had survived not by hardening, but by opening. By refusing to disappear. By choosing to live forward rather than remain tethered to what had been lost. The story of my life had not ended at a funeral. It had been reclaimed there. And every day since had been a deliberate, meaningful continuation. The last year unfolded with a gentleness that still felt unfamiliar, like a language I had once known and was only now relearning. I no longer measured time by anniversaries of pain or legal milestones. Instead, days marked themselves by quieter achievements, a conversation that ended in understanding rather than defensiveness, an afternoon spent absorbed in thought without guilt, a night of unbroken sleep that felt like a gift rather than a rarity. Healing, I realized, was not a destination but a steady practice. I spent more time writing, not with the intention of publishing or preserving a legacy, but simply to hear my own voice without interruption. Some mornings I filled pages with memories, others with questions, and sometimes with nothing more than observations about the light in the room or the rhythm of my breath. The act itself became grounding. For decades, my thoughts had been filtered, edited, adjusted to fit someone else's comfort. Now they flowed freely, unjudged. Daniel's presence in my life grew steadier. He began stopping by without formal plans, sometimes just to sit and talk, sometimes to help with small tasks around the house. We learned each other again, not as roles defined by obligation, but as two adults navigating a shared history. There were still moments of tension, particularly when the past surfaced unexpectedly, but we faced them without retreat. The honesty between us felt fragile yet resilient, like glass reinforced with steel. One afternoon, while we were sorting through old boxes in the garage, Daniel found a stack of notebooks from my years at the firm. He flipped through them, surprised by the neat handwriting, the detailed analyses. He looked at me with something like awe. I had never told him much about that part of my life. Seeing his expression, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not vindication, but recognition. It mattered more than I had anticipated. As autumn returned, I accepted an invitation to speak at a community seminar on financial autonomy. Standing at the podium, I felt a familiar steadiness settle in. I spoke about transparency, about the danger of relinquishing agency out of love or convenience. I did not frame my story as a cautionary tale alone, but as an example of recovery. The questions afterward were thoughtful, earnest. Several women lingered to thank me, their eyes bright with possibility. I drove home that evening with a sense of purpose that felt deeply rooted. The house continued to evolve. I painted walls in colors I loved, not ones that suggested neutrality or restraint. I replaced heavy furniture with lighter pieces, allowing rooms to breathe. Each change reflected an internal shift, a willingness to occupy space fully. Visitors commented on how welcoming it felt. I smiled, knowing that warmth came from presence, not design. On quiet nights, I sometimes thought of Linda, not with anger, but with a distant curiosity. I wondered what became of her after everything unraveled. The question no longer carried urgency. Her story was no longer entangled with mine. She had been a chapter, not the conclusion. Letting go of that curiosity felt like closing a door gently rather than slamming it shut. The garden remained my sanctuary. I spent hours tending it, learning the patterns of growth and rest. There was comfort in the predictability of seasons, in the reminder that nothing flourished without periods of dormancy. I often reflected on how close I had come to cutting down the tree that now stood strong and generous. Survival, I had learned, was not always visible in the moment. Sometimes it waited quietly for conditions to change. The anniversary of the court ruling passed without ceremony. I noticed the date only when it appeared on my calendar, then crossed it out without comment. Justice had been necessary, but it did not define me. What defined me now were the choices I made daily, the boundaries I honored, the joy I allowed myself without apology. Daniel invited me to meet his partner that winter. The introduction was tentative but sincere. She treated me with respect, curiosity, and warmth. Watching them together, I felt a cautious hope. I had once feared being replaced, erased from my own family narrative. Now I understand that love expands rather than diminishes when grounded in honesty. I welcomed her without reservation, trusting my instincts. At a small holiday gathering, someone asked me what had changed most in my life over the past few years. I considered the question carefully before answering. It was not my circumstances, though those had shifted dramatically. It was not even my relationships, though many had been reshaped. What had changed most, I realized, was my willingness to trust myself, to believe my perceptions, to act on them without seeking permission. Late one evening, after everyone had gone and the house had settled into stillness, I walked through each room slowly. I touched the backs of chairs, the spines of books, the frames of photographs. These objects no longer anchored me to loss. They reminded me of continuity, of the fact that life moved forward even when it broke apart. I paused at the window, looking out at the quiet street, and felt a profound sense of belonging. In bed that night, I reflected on the woman I had been at the funeral, seated off to the side, invisible and stunned. I wished I could tell her what lay ahead, that the pain would not destroy her. That truth, however brutal, would become a foundation rather than a weapon. That her life would not end in erasure, but begin anew in clarity. I understood now that survival was not about endurance alone. It was about transformation. About refusing to remain defined by betrayal or silence. About choosing to live deliberately, even when the path forward was uncertain. I had done that. Not perfectly, not without fear, but with integrity. As sleep claimed me, I felt gratitude settle gently in my chest. Gratitude for the strength I had rediscovered, for the relationships rebuilt, for the freedom claimed. My story had not been easy, but it was mine. Fully, unequivocally mine. And in that knowledge I found peace.